On November 12, 1844, exactly 7 days after James Knox Polk claimed victory in one of America's most contentious presidential elections, 31 bodies were discovered floating face down in the Susquehanna River near the Pennsylvania border. Each man bore identical markings, a crude X carved into their left palm, and each clutched a waterlogged ballot bearing the same candidate's name. Local authorities buried the story deeper than the victims themselves, claiming they were victims of a riverboat accident that never happened. For 180 years, the truth about what really occurred in the remote township of Millfield has remained locked away in courthouse records that were supposedly destroyed in a convenient fire 3 decades later. But recently discovered correspondence between a terrified county clerk and his brother reveals a conspiracy so disturbing that it challenged the very foundation of American democracy. Before we continue with the story of Millfield's blood-soaked election, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by America's darkest historical secrets, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from, because what happened in Pennsylvania could have happened anywhere. The autumn of 1844 found America caught in the grip of political fever, unlike anything the young nation had witnessed before. The presidential race between Democrat James Knox Polk and Whig Henry Clay had torn families apart, set neighbors against one another, and transformed quiet communities into battlegrounds of ideology. Nowhere was this divide more pronounced than in the coal-rich valleys of central Pennsylvania, where immigrant laborers clashed with established farmers over questions of territorial expansion, tariff policies, and the growing specter of slavery's westward spread. Millfield Township, nestled in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains along the Susquehanna's eastern bank, exemplified this national tension in miniature. Home to roughly 400 souls, the community straddled 2 distinct worlds. The eastern half housed prosperous German and Irish farming families who had worked the fertile bottomland for 3 generations, their modest prosperity built on wheat, corn, and carefully tended livestock. These families, led by prominent landowners like Heinrich Zimmerman and Cornelius O'Brien, favored Clay's American system, protective tariffs to shield their crops from foreign competition, and federal investment in canals and roads to carry their goods to distant markets. The western portion of Millfield told a different story entirely. Here, newcomers from the coal regions of Wales and Scotland had established a rough-hewn settlement around the Blackstone mine, a dangerous but profitable anthracite operation that had opened just 2 years earlier. These miners, under the informal leadership of a fierce Welsh immigrant named Gwilym Parry, supported Polk's promises of territorial expansion and lower tariffs that would reduce the cost of the tools and equipment their industry desperately needed. Between these 2 factions stood the town's small merchant class, caught uncomfortably in the middle. Store owner Samuel Hartwell, postmaster William Kensington, and the local physician Dr. Edmund Fairchild tried desperately to maintain neutrality, but neutrality had become a luxury that Millfield could no longer afford. The physical geography of the town seemed to mirror its political divisions. A narrow valley road connected the farming community in the east with the mining settlement in the west, passing through a small commercial district that consisted of Hartwell's general store, Kensington's post office, Dr. Fairchild's medical practice, and the Millfield Inn, a weathered 2-story building that served as the community's unofficial meeting place. Just south of this central area stood the township's most imposing structure, a sturdy limestone courthouse that had been built in 1834 with funds raised through community subscription. By October 1844, this courthouse had become the epicenter of Millfield's growing political crisis. Township elections were scheduled for November 5th, the same day as the presidential contest, and local offices that had once been filled through gentlemanly agreement now sparked bitter competition. The position of township supervisor, traditionally held by Heinrich Zimmerman, was being challenged by Gwilym Parry. The tax collector's post, long occupied by William Kensington, faced opposition from Owen Pritchard, Parry's brother-in-law. Most controversially, the position of Justice of the Peace, which carried the power to settle property disputes, authorize arrests, and officiate marriages, had drawn 4 separate candidates. As election day approached, both sides engaged in increasingly aggressive tactics. Farmers organized torchlight parades through the mining district, singing patriotic songs that sounded suspiciously like threats to Welsh-speaking residents. Miners gathered outside Hartwell's store each evening, their conversations growing louder and more pointed as they discussed the unfair advantages enjoyed by the old families. Children stopped playing together across factional lines. Wives ceased speaking to neighbors whose husbands supported the opposing ticket. The tension reached a breaking point on November 3rd, just 2 days before the election, when someone, the identity was never determined, painted crude slogans across the courthouse walls during the night. "Polk means poverty" appeared in dripping red letters above the main entrance, while "Clay's cronies go home" was scrawled across the building's eastern face. When township residents gathered the following morning to assess the damage, angry words quickly escalated into pushing matches that Dr. Fairchild barely managed to diffuse by threatening to summon the county sheriff from 30 miles away. That evening, as November's chill settled over the Susquehanna Valley, both factions held final campaign rallies. The farmers gathered in Zimmerman's large barn, where Heinrich delivered a passionate speech about preserving the values that had built their community. Meanwhile, the miners assembled around a bonfire near the Blackstone mine, where Gwilym Parry spoke of opportunity and justice for working men. Each group could see the other's fire burning in the distance, and as the night wore on, those distant flames seemed to flicker with ominous promise. What none of them could have imagined was that within 72 hours, 31 members of their community would be dead, and the survivors would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too terrible to reveal. November 5th, 1844 dawned gray and bitter cold across central Pennsylvania. A thin layer of frost covered the Susquehanna Valley, and a persistent wind from the north carried the scent of coming snow. Despite the chill, or perhaps because of it, both factions in Millfield Township rose early and prepared for what everyone understood would be more than a simple election. The courthouse opened for voting at sunrise, as required by Pennsylvania law. Judge Ezra Hawthorne, a stern man in his 70s who had overseen township elections for nearly 2 decades, arrived to find both sides already assembled in the building's shadow. Heinrich Zimmerman stood with his farming supporters on the eastern side of the courthouse square, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as they spoke in hushed German and English. Gwilym Parry's miners gathered on the western side, their coal-blackened faces grim beneath woolen caps, conversing in rapid Welsh that sounded like stones grinding together. The voting process itself unfolded with deceptive calm. Pennsylvania's election laws required voters to cast handwritten ballots, which were then placed in a locked wooden box under the supervision of 3 election judges. In Millfield, these positions were held by Judge Hawthorne, Samuel Hartwell, and, in a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who farmed a small plot near the township's southern boundary. Throughout the morning, men from both factions approached the courthouse in small groups, cast their votes, and departed without incident. The tension was palpable, but controlled, like steam-building pressure in a closed kettle. Women and children watched from windows and doorways, forbidden by law from voting, but deeply invested in the outcome. Even the township's dogs seemed to sense the atmosphere, staying close to their owners' heels and avoiding the courthouse square entirely. At precisely noon, as Judge Hawthorne called for a brief recess to allow the election judges to take their midday meal, a commotion erupted from the direction of the Millfield Inn. Owen Pritchard, Gwilym Parry's brother-in-law and candidate for tax collector, came stumbling into the square, his face bloodied and his coat torn. Behind him walked 3 men that nobody in the community recognized, strangers with the rough appearance of rivermen, wearing heavy boots and carrying walking sticks that looked suspiciously like clubs. "They tried to buy my vote," Pritchard gasped, pointing at the strangers. "Offered me $50 to withdraw from the tax collector's race." When I refused, they said I'd regret it. Heinrich Zimmermann stepped forward, his weathered face flushed with indignation. Who are these men? They have no business in our election. The largest of the strangers, a barrel-chested man with graying whiskers, spat into the frost-covered grass. We got business wherever honest Americans are trying to vote, he said in an accent that placed him somewhere along the Ohio River. Name's Pike. These are my associates, Mr. Crawford and Mr. Wade. We represent certain interests that want to see this election conducted fairly. Judge Hawthorne, despite his advanced age, possessed the authority of decades spent maintaining order in frontier communities. I don't care who you represent, he declared, his voice carrying across the square. This is a local election for local people. You gentlemen will leave immediately, or I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace. Pike's laugh was like gravel being poured from a bucket. You'll have us arrested? With what authority? Your county sheriff is 30 miles away, and from what I hear, he's got his hands full with election troubles of his own. He gestured toward his companions. We're staying until every vote is counted. What happened next would be debated for generations, though the facts themselves were never in dispute. Gwilym Parry, perhaps emboldened by what he saw as an attack on one of his supporters, or perhaps simply unable to contain months of accumulated frustration, strode across the square and confronted Pike directly. You heard the judge, Parry said, his Welsh accent thickening with anger. Leave our community in peace. Pike studied Parry for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Welsh coal miner, aren't you? Thought so. You people are always causing trouble where you're not wanted. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Matter of fact, we've got a list here of troublemakers who shouldn't be voting today. Your name's right at the top. The paper Pike displayed was covered with handwriting, though from a distance nobody could make out the specific names. What they could see was that the list was long, perhaps 30 or 40 entries, and that several names had already been crossed out with heavy black lines. Dr. Edmund Fairchild, who had been observing from the courthouse steps, felt his medical training kick in as he recognized the signs of an escalating crisis. Heart rates were accelerating, muscles were tensing, and voices were rising toward the threshold where rational conversation becomes impossible. He stepped between the opposing groups, his black medical bag somehow lending authority to his words. Gentlemen, please, he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We're all Americans here. We're all neighbors. Whatever differences we have can be settled through the democratic process we're here to honor. Pike's response chilled everyone who heard it. Democracy's a fine thing, Doctor, when it's limited to the right sort of people, but when foreigners and troublemakers start thinking they can vote themselves into power. He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear enough. The stranger's words seemed to release something that had been building in the Millfield community for months. Heinrich Zimmermann stepped forward to support Dr. Fairchild's call for peace, but several of his farming supporters moved in the opposite direction, surrounding Pike and his associates with obvious approval. Meanwhile, Gwilym Parry's miners began closing ranks behind their leader, their faces hardening into the expressions they wore when dangerous work needed to be done underground. Judge Hawthorne, recognizing that his authority was rapidly diminishing, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than closing the election and sending everyone home, he chose to continue with the voting process, hoping that the formal structure of democratic procedure would restore order to the increasingly volatile situation. The election will proceed as scheduled, he announced. All qualified voters will cast their ballots in an orderly fashion. Anyone who disrupts this process will be held accountable under Pennsylvania law. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Pennsylvania law held little sway in Millfield Township that day. Pike and his associates stationed themselves near the courthouse entrance, examining each voter with obvious scrutiny. When miners approached to cast their ballots, the strangers would consult their mysterious list and engage in whispered conferences that often resulted in challenges to the voters' eligibility. By 4 o'clock, with darkness already beginning to gather in the valley, Only half the expected votes had been cast. Those miners who had managed to vote did so under the hostile stares of Pike's men, while farmers who supported Zimmerman's ticket were waved through with encouraging nods. The imbalance was obvious to everyone present, but Judge Hawthorne seemed paralyzed by the complexity of the situation he faced. As the final hour of voting approached, Gwilym Parry made a decision that would seal his fate, and the fate of 30 others. He gathered his supporters, not just the miners but also several Welsh and Scottish families who farmed small plots in the township's western areas, and marched them toward the courthouse in a compact group. Their intention was clear. They would vote as a bloc, overwhelming Pike's ability to challenge individual voters through sheer numbers. The strategy might have worked in a normal election, but November 5th, 1844 was not a normal election, and Pike was not a normal observer. As Parry's group approached the courthouse steps, the stranger raised his hand in a signal that his associates clearly understood. What followed happened so quickly that witnesses would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Pike called out that he was placing the entire group under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit election fraud. Several miners responded by pushing forward, demanding to know by what authority Pike claimed such power. Heinrich Zimmerman's farmers, believing that their opponents were attempting to rush the voting booth through intimidation, moved to block the courthouse entrance. In the growing confusion, someone, nobody ever determined who, threw the first punch. Within seconds, the courthouse square erupted into chaos as men who had been neighbors for years found themselves locked in vicious combat. The sound of fists meeting flesh mingled with curses in English, German, and Welsh, while women screamed for their husbands to stop fighting and children scattered to hiding places behind buildings and trees. Judge Hawthorne, despite his age, waded into the melee in an attempt to restore order. He managed to reach the courthouse steps and began shouting for everyone to stop fighting, but his voice was lost in the din of battle. Dr. Fairchild abandoned his medical bag and joined the judge's efforts, grabbing combatants and physically separating them while pleading for sanity to prevail. The fight might have burned itself out through exhaustion, as such confrontations often do, but Pike had not come to Millfield alone, and he had not come unprepared. At the height of the battle, when nearly every adult male in the community was engaged in combat, a shrill whistle pierced the air from the direction of the Susquehanna River. The sound seemed to freeze everyone in place, bruised faces turning toward the water with expressions of growing alarm. Through the gathering dusk, they could see figures moving along the riverbank. Not just a few men, but dozens of them, carrying lanterns that bobbed like fireflies as they approached the township. Pike wiped blood from his split lip and smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Told you boys we represented certain interests," he said to the stunned crowd. "Those interests don't take kindly to election fraud." As the lanterns drew closer, the residents of Millfield Township began to realize that they faced something far more serious than a simple election dispute. The approaching figures moved with military precision, and the light from their lanterns gleamed off objects that were definitely not walking sticks. Judge Hawthorne, his formal authority already undermined, tried one last time to assert legal control over the situation. "Whatever your grievances," he called out to Pike, "they must be settled through proper legal channels. I'm ordering you and your associates to leave this community immediately." Pike's response would be remembered by every survivor for the rest of their lives. "Judge," he said with mock respect, "your court's been adjourned." The men who emerged from the darkness along the Susquehanna's banks that evening were unlike anything the residents of Millfield had ever encountered. They moved with the disciplined coordination of military veterans, but their equipment and demeanor suggested something far more sinister than official law enforcement. Each carried a rifle and a coil of rope, and their faces bore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence as a tool of business. Their leader, who introduced himself only as Captain Thorne, conferred briefly with Pike before addressing the assembled crowd. His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded men in battle, though his uniform belonged to no recognized military organization. "Citizens of Millfield," Thorne announced, his words cutting through the cold November air like sharpened steel. "We have evidence of extensive election fraud, conspiracy against lawful government, and seditious activities designed to undermine American democracy. Under the authority vested in me by concerned patriots, I hereby declare this township under provisional supervision until proper order can be restored." The residents of Millfield exchanged glances of growing panic. Heinrich Zimmermann, despite the blood trickling from his nose, stepped forward to challenge this extraordinary claim. "By what legal authority do you make such a declaration?" "We are citizens of Pennsylvania, operating under the laws of this Commonwealth and the United States Constitution." Captain Thorne's smile was colder than the November wind. "The Constitution protects American citizens, Mr. Zimmermann. It does not protect those who would subvert American institutions through fraud and violence." He gestured towards several of his men, who began unrolling what appeared to be an official document. "We have sworn affidavits from reliable sources indicating that foreign agitators have infiltrated this community for the purpose of manipulating election results." The document Thorne's men displayed was impressive in its official appearance, complete with elaborate seals and signatures. From a distance, it certainly looked like a legal warrant, though Judge Hawthorne noted several irregularities that suggested forgery. However, with armed men surrounding the courthouse square, challenging the document's authenticity seemed both futile and dangerous. Dr. Edmund Fairchild, whose medical training had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution. "Captain Thorne, surely any concerns about election irregularities can be addressed through proper legal channels. Our county seat has qualified officials who can investigate any allegations and ensure that justice is served." Thorne's response revealed the true nature of the threat facing Millfield Township. "Doctor, the corruption we're addressing extends far beyond this little valley. County officials, state officials, even federal authorities have been compromised by the same foreign influences that have taken root here. We represent citizens who refuse to stand by while their country is stolen from them." The implications of this statement sent a chill through everyone present. What they faced was not merely a group of election observers or even ordinary criminals, but rather organized vigilantes who believed themselves to be operating above and beyond existing legal authority. Such groups had appeared sporadically throughout American history during times of political crisis, but Millfield's residents had never imagined they would encounter such extremism in their own peaceful valley. Gwilym Parry, despite the obvious danger, refused to be intimidated. His years of dangerous work in coal mines had taught him that sometimes the only way to survive was to face hazards directly. "You speak of foreign influences," he said, his Welsh accent more pronounced under stress. "But I see nothing here but American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. If you have specific accusations, present them to proper authorities. Otherwise, take your men and leave our community in peace." The confrontation that followed would be seared into the memory of every witness. Captain Thorne studied Parry with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey, then nodded to Pike, who consulted his mysterious list once again. "Gwilym Parry," Pike read aloud, "native of Wales, arrived in United States 1841, employed at Blackstone Mine, suspected of organizing foreign workers against American interests, advocating for policies that would benefit hostile foreign powers." He looked up from the document. "That sound accurate to you, Parry?" The Welsh miner's face flushed with indignation. "Every word of that is either false or twisted beyond recognition. I came to this country legally, I work honestly for my wages, and I vote according to my conscience, as is my right as a naturalized citizen." Captain Thorne's response chilled everyone who heard it. "Rights are earned through loyalty, Parry. They can also be revoked." What happened next unfolded with terrifying efficiency. At Thorne's signal, his men began separating the crowd according to some predetermined criteria. Farmers who had supported Zimmermann's ticket were directed to move toward the eastern side of the courthouse square, while miners and their supporters were ordered to gather near the western edge. Anyone who protested or questioned this process was met with rifle butts and stern warnings about resisting lawful authority. The separation revealed the true extent of Pike's list. 31 men found themselves isolated from their families and neighbors, standing under the watchful eyes of Thorne's armed guards. The group included not only prominent miners like Parry and Pritchard, but also several small farmers who had supported the Democratic ticket, a few merchants who had expressed sympathies for Irish and German immigrants, and even Thomas Brennan, one of the 3 election judges. Judge Hawthorne, despite his age and the obvious danger he faced, attempted to assert his legal authority one final time. "Captain Thorne, I cannot permit this illegal detention of American citizens. As a duly appointed judge of this township, I order you to release these men immediately." Thorne's response demonstrated the complete breakdown of legal authority that his presence had precipitated. "Judge, your appointment came from a corrupt system that we no longer recognize. These men are being detained pending investigation of their subversive activities." He paused, studying the elderly judge with obvious contempt. "Unless you'd like to join them, I suggest you confine your activities to observing." The threat was unmistakable, and Judge Hawthorne found himself facing the most difficult decision of his long career. He could continue to assert his legal authority and almost certainly be arrested or worse, or he could step aside and allow these vigilantes to proceed with their illegal actions. The choice was made more complicated by his awareness that resistance might endanger not only himself, but also the women and children who remained in the square. As darkness fell completely over the Susquehanna Valley, Captain Thorne ordered his men to light additional torches around the courthouse square. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd, creating an atmosphere that combined elements of a medieval trial with the organized brutality of military occupation. "Citizens of Millfield," Thorne announced, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "we will now proceed with a proper investigation of the seditious activities that have corrupted your community. Those who cooperate with this investigation will be treated fairly. Those who obstruct justice will face appropriate consequences." The 31 detained men stood in a tight group, surrounded by armed guards, their faces reflecting fear, anger, and growing desperation. Their families watched from the edges of the square, held back by more of Thorne's men whenever they attempted to approach their husbands, fathers, and sons. Samuel Hartwell, the store owner who had tried to remain neutral throughout the election crisis, found his voice despite the terror that gripped him. "Captain, these men have done nothing more than vote according to their consciences. Surely that cannot be considered sedition in America." Thorne's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew noticeably colder. "Mr. Hartwell, voting is indeed a sacred American right, but voting fraudulently, conspiring with foreign agents, and attempting to subvert legitimate government are serious crimes that demand serious consequences." The store owner pressed on, perhaps recognizing that someone needed to speak for justice before it was too late. "What evidence do you have of fraud or conspiracy? What foreign agents? These are our neighbors, men we've known for years." Captain Thorne gestured toward Pike, who produced another official-looking document. "We have extensive documentation of communications between these men and agents of hostile foreign powers. We have evidence of organized efforts to manipulate election results. We have witnesses who will testify to seditious conversations and planning." The documents Pike displayed appeared impressive, filled with official seals and elaborate handwriting. However, Judge Hawthorne, despite his precarious position, noticed that the papers were held too far away for anyone to read the actual content. He also observed that Thorne's men seemed nervous, constantly glancing toward the river as if expecting something or someone. Dr. Fairchild, whose medical practice had brought him into contact with men from all walks of life, attempted to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in their captors. "Captain, even if these accusations were true, surely the proper course would be to turn these men over to county authorities for trial. Summary justice serves no one, and helps nothing. Thorne's response revealed the true depths of the conspiracy that had descended upon Millfield Township. Doctor, county authorities are part of the same corrupt system that allowed this situation to develop. State authorities have been compromised by the same foreign influences. We represent the only remaining hope for justice in this matter. The implications were staggering. What the residents of Millfield faced was not merely a group of vigilantes operating outside the law, but rather an organized conspiracy that claimed to supersede all existing legal authority. Such movements had appeared periodically throughout American history during times of political crisis, but never before had the isolated valley community encountered such extremism directly. As the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that Captain Thorne and his men had not come to Millfield for a simple election intervention. They had come prepared for something far more sinister, and the 31 detained men were about to discover exactly what that something was. The temperature continued to drop as midnight approached, and a thin layer of snow began to fall across the Susquehanna Valley. In the flickering torchlight, the snowflakes looked like ash from some distant fire, settling over the courthouse square with ominous silence. As the clock in the Millfield courthouse tower chimed midnight, Captain Thorne made an announcement that transformed an already terrifying situation into something approaching absolute horror. The 31 detained men would be transported to a secure location for detailed interrogation regarding their alleged seditious activities. The secure location, it quickly became apparent, was not a proper jail or detention facility, but rather a collection of abandoned buildings near an old ferry crossing 3 miles downstream along the Susquehanna. The site had once served as a thriving river port, but changes in shipping routes had left it deserted for nearly a decade. Its isolation made it perfect for activities that required freedom from observation. Thorne's men bound the detainees' hands with rope and formed them into a column for the march to the river. The sight of their neighbors, husbands and fathers being led away like prisoners of war proved too much for several family members, who attempted to follow despite the obvious danger. Mrs. Catherine Parry, Gwillim's wife of 15 years, broke free from the crowd and ran toward her husband. "You cannot take him," she cried, her Welsh accent thick with emotion. "He has committed no crime. He voted as is his right under American law." One of Thorne's guards roughly pushed her back, but not before she managed to grasp her husband's bound hands. "Whatever they accuse you of," she whispered urgently, "remember that truth will prevail. God sees everything, even in darkness." Her words would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The march to the old ferry crossing took nearly 2 hours through difficult terrain. The detainees, still wearing their election day clothes, were forced to navigate muddy paths and steep riverbank slopes while bound and under constant guard. Several of the older men, including Thomas Brennan, struggled to keep pace and were prodded forward with rifle butts when they faltered. Dr. Fairchild, who had been permitted to accompany the column in case medical attention became necessary, observed details that his scientific training compelled him to remember. Thorne's men moved with obvious familiarity through terrain that should have been unknown to outsiders. They knew exactly which paths to take, which obstacles to avoid, and where to find the most secure routes along the treacherous riverbank. This level of reconnaissance suggested planning that extended far beyond the November 5th election. The abandoned ferry crossing consisted of several weathered buildings surrounding a stone wharf that extended into the Susquehanna. The largest structure had once served as a warehouse for goods awaiting river transport, while smaller buildings had housed the ferry operations offices and equipment. All showed signs of long abandonment: broken windows, sagging roofs, and walls stained with years of river moisture. Captain Thorne directed his men to secure the detainees in the warehouse, a drafty building roughly 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The structure's stone foundation and thick timber walls would contain sound effectively, while its location 3 miles from the nearest inhabited building ensured complete privacy for whatever interrogation methods Thorne intended to employ. Inside the warehouse, the 31 men found themselves in a space that had been prepared for their arrival. Lengths of rope hung from ceiling beams, chairs had been arranged in a rough circle, and several tables held items that gleamed ominously in the lantern light. Knives, hammers, and other tools that could serve purposes far removed from their original functions. Pike, who seemed to serve as Thorne's chief deputy, consulted his list one final time before addressing the prisoners. "Gentlemen, you are here because reliable sources have identified you as participants in a conspiracy to subvert American democratic institutions through fraud, intimidation, and coordination with hostile foreign powers. The severity of these charges demands thorough investigation." Gwilym Parry, despite his bound hands and desperate circumstances, refused to be intimidated. What sources? What foreign powers? These are wild accusations without foundation, in fact. Pike's smile was colder than the November wind that whistled through the warehouse's broken windows. "Mr. Parry, your own words and actions provide all the evidence we need. You have publicly advocated for policies that would benefit foreign nations at America's expense. You have organized foreign workers against American interests. You have conspired to manipulate election results through illegal voting practices." The Welsh miner's face flushed with indignation. "Every word of that is false. I have advocated for fair wages and safe working conditions. I have helped fellow immigrants understand their rights under American law. I have voted according to my conscience, which is my right as a naturalized citizen." Captain Thorne stepped forward, his presence commanding attention even in the dim lantern light. "Rights, Mr. Parry, are earned through loyalty and maintained through obedience to lawful authority. When foreign-born residents conspire against American interests, they forfeit their claim to American protection." The implications of this statement sent a chill through everyone present. What they faced was not merely illegal detention, but rather a systematic rejection of the legal principles upon which American society was founded. The concept that citizenship could be revoked through accusations alone struck at the heart of constitutional government. Dr. Fairchild, whose medical practice had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, attempted to introduce reason into an increasingly irrational situation. "Captain Thorne, even if these men were guilty of the crimes you allege, they would still be entitled to legal representation, formal charges, and trial by jury. What you propose violates every principle of American justice." Thorne's response revealed the true nature of the conspiracy that had descended upon Millfield Township. "Doctor, American justice has been corrupted by foreign influences and domestic traitors. Traditional legal processes have been compromised beyond repair. We represent a return to original American principles that place loyalty to country above procedural technicalities." The interrogation that followed stretched through the remaining hours of darkness and into the grey dawn of November 6th. Thorne's men took the detainees one at a time, using methods that Dr. Fairchild's medical training made him recognize as torture. The screams that echoed through the warehouse provided a horrifying soundtrack to questions about voting patterns, political associations, and alleged communications with foreign agents. What made the situation even more disturbing was the systematic nature of the interrogation. Thorne's men possessed detailed information about each detainee's personal life, family relationships, business dealings, and political opinions. They knew which miners had expressed sympathy for Irish independence movements, which farmers had criticized American territorial expansion policies, and which merchants had conducted business with recent immigrants. This level of intelligence gathering suggested surveillance activities that extended far beyond the November 5th election. Someone had been watching Millfield Township for months, possibly years, compiling dossiers on residents whose political views or ethnic backgrounds marked them as potential threats to some undefined version of American purity. As morning light filtered through the warehouse's broken windows, revealing the full horror of the night's activities, several patterns became clear to those with the presence of mind to observe them. First, The torture was designed not merely to extract information, but to force confessions to crimes that existed only in the accuser's minds. Second, the interrogators seemed less interested in actual answers than in creating documentation that would justify predetermined conclusions. Third, and most ominously, several of Thorne's men had begun making references to final solutions and permanent resolution of the foreign influence problem. By mid-morning on November 6th, it became clear that the 31 detainees would not be returning to their families. Whatever Captain Thorne and his men had planned for their prisoners, it did not include release or transfer to legitimate legal authorities. The realization struck different men in different ways. Some, like Gwilym Parry, maintained their defiance even as evidence mounted that defiance would prove fatal. Others, including several of the older farmers, began attempting to negotiate their release through confessions to imaginary crimes. A few, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, spent their final hours in prayer or quiet conversation with fellow prisoners. Dr. Fairchild, whose medical oath had committed him to preserving life regardless of circumstances, made a desperate attempt to communicate with the outside world. Using supplies from his medical bag and taking advantage of a moment when his guard's attention was elsewhere, he managed to write a brief message describing the situation at the ferry crossing. The message was hidden in his coat, with the hope that it might someday reach authorities who would investigate the disappearance of 31 American citizens. As the afternoon of November 6th wore on, Thorne's men began making obvious preparations for something that would occur after darkness fell. Boats were moved into position along the wharf, ropes were checked and rechecked, and several guards were posted at points along the riverbank where approaching traffic might observe activities at the ferry crossing. The 31 men of Millfield Township spent what would be their final hours in conversations that ranged from desperate planning to quiet acceptance. Some discussed escape attempts that all recognized as hopeless given their bonds and the number of armed guards. Others spoke of their families, sharing messages they hoped might somehow reach wives and children they would never see again. A few engaged in heated debates about whether their political activities had somehow justified their fate, while most simply tried to maintain whatever dignity remained available to condemned men. Thomas Brennan, the Irish farmer who had served as an election judge, found himself consumed by guilt over his role in the events that had led to their capture. "If I had refused to serve," he whispered to Owen Pritchard, "perhaps none of this would have happened. Perhaps they would have targeted someone else's community." Pritchard, despite his own terror, attempted to comfort his fellow prisoner. "Thomas, you did nothing wrong. You served your community as requested and performed your duties honestly. The evil here lies with these vigilantes, not with honest men trying to participate in democratic government." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Captain Thorne, who had come to deliver what he termed final instructions to the prisoners. His words revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives and would soon end them entirely. "Gentlemen," Thorne announced, his voice carrying the authority of a military commander addressing troops before battle, "you have been found guilty of sedition, conspiracy, and treason against the United States of America. Under the extraordinary circumstances that face our nation, and in the absence of legal institutions capable of addressing crimes of this magnitude, you will be executed according to the judgment of loyal American citizens." The warehouse fell silent, except for the sound of 31 men breathing in short, desperate gasps. Even those who had suspected this outcome found themselves stunned by the casual manner in which their death sentence was delivered. Gwilym Parry, his Welsh pride intact despite hours of torture, found his voice one final time. "Captain Thorne, history will judge what you do here today. You may silence our voices, but you cannot silence the truth of what we represent. The promise that America belongs to all who embrace its ideals, not merely those who share your prejudices." Thorne's response demonstrated the complete moral corruption that had enabled his actions. "Mr. Parry, history is written by survivors. After tonight, your version of American ideals will be nothing more than a cautionary tale about the price of disloyalty. As darkness fell over the Susquehanna River on November 6, 1844, Captain Thorne's men began implementing a plan that had clearly been developed with meticulous attention to detail. The execution of 31 men required careful coordination to ensure that no evidence would remain to incriminate the perpetrators or reveal the true scope of their conspiracy. The method chosen was both brutal and practical. Each prisoner would be weighted with stones, taken out onto the river in small boats, and thrown into the deep water near the main channel, where the current would carry bodies downstream toward larger population centers. Any remains that eventually surfaced would be found far from Millfield Township, appearing to be victims of river accidents or ordinary crimes rather than systematic murder. Dr. Fairchild, whose medical knowledge made him acutely aware of what drowning entailed, made one final appeal to whatever humanity might remain in their captors. "Captain, I beg you to reconsider this course of action. These men have families who love them, children who depend on them, communities that need them. Whatever crimes you believe they have committed, surely they do not deserve death." Thorne's response revealed the ideological fanaticism that had driven him to this point. "Doctor, sometimes society must be purged of corrupting influences before it can heal. These men represent a cancer that threatens the very survival of American civilization. Their removal is not murder, it is surgery." The comparison to medical treatment demonstrated how thoroughly Thorne had rationalized his actions. In his mind, the mass murder he was about to commit represented not criminal behavior, but rather patriotic duty performed in service to a higher cause. Pike, meanwhile, had been making final preparations for the disposal operation. Boats had been positioned along the wharf, each equipped with sufficient stones to ensure that bodies would sink immediately upon entering the water. Lanterns had been arranged to provide light for the loading process while remaining invisible to anyone who might be traveling along the river's far shore. The systematic nature of these preparations suggested experience with similar operations. Thorne's men moved with the efficiency of soldiers executing a familiar drill, indicating that the Millfield massacre was not their first such action. The implications were staggering. If this conspiracy had claimed other victims in other communities, the death toll might extend far beyond 31 men. As the prisoners were led from the warehouse to the wharf, several attempted desperate escape efforts that only resulted in additional beatings. Others tried to bargain for their lives by offering confessions to imaginary crimes or promising to leave the country voluntarily. A few maintained dignified silence, refusing to give their murderers the satisfaction of witnessing their fear. The loading process began with the oldest prisoners, perhaps out of some twisted sense of mercy that would spare them the agony of watching others die first. Thomas Brennan, the election judge whose only crime had been honest service to his community, was among the first to be forced into a boat with 3 armed guards. As Brennan's boat disappeared into the darkness, those remaining on the wharf could hear the sound of oars cutting through water, followed by a brief disturbance that suggested a struggle, and then silence. The pattern was repeated as boat after boat carried prisoners into the night, returning empty except for their crews. Dr. Fairchild, who had been designated for execution despite his attempts to remain neutral during the election crisis, found himself among the final group awaiting transport. His medical training compelled him to observe details that others might have missed, and what he saw filled him with a horror that transcended even his own approaching death. Several of Thorne's men displayed obvious signs of psychological disturbance, nervous tics, involuntary trembling, and facial expressions that suggested internal conflict between their actions and their remaining conscience. These were not hardened killers comfortable with mass murder, but rather ordinary men who had been convinced to commit extraordinary evil in service to their political beliefs. The realization offered a faint glimmer of hope. If these men retained any capacity for moral reasoning, they might eventually be consumed by guilt over their actions. Such guilt could lead to confessions, investigations, and ultimately justice for the victims of the Millfield massacre. But that justice, if it ever came, would arrive too late for the 31 men whose lives were ending in the cold waters of the Susquehanna River. As Dr. Fairchild was forced into what would be his final boat ride, he managed to slip the message he had written into a crevice between stones on the wharf. The hiding place was precarious at best, but it represented the only hope that the truth about November 6, 1844, might someday be revealed. The boat carrying Dr. Fairchild moved slowly through the dark water, guided by guards who seemed reluctant to complete their assigned task. Perhaps they recognized that killing a physician, a man whose life had been devoted to healing rather than politics, represented a moral boundary that once crossed could never be recrossed. In the end, however, their hesitation proved irrelevant. The current that would soon carry 31 bodies downstream showed no mercy for physicians, farmers, miners, or election judges. Death in the Susquehanna River was democratic in a way that the political process in Millfield Township had not been allowed to be. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millfield intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The final boat returned to the wharf at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on November 7, 1844. Captain Thorne's men had successfully murdered 31 American citizens and disposed of their bodies in a manner designed to conceal both the crime and the criminals. What they had not anticipated was that their carefully planned operation would begin to unravel almost immediately. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Dr. Fairchild's horse, which had been left tied near the warehouse during the interrogation, had broken free and wandered back toward Millfield Township during the night. The animal's return without its rider raised immediate alarm among family members who had spent a sleepless night wondering about the fate of their loved ones. Mrs. Catherine Parry, whose husband Gwilym had been among the first prisoners taken, organized a search party that set out for the ferry crossing at dawn. The group included several women whose husbands had been detained, as well as a few men who had been deemed insufficiently suspicious to warrant arrest. Their leader was Heinrich Zimmermann, the German farmer whose political opponent Gwilym Parry had become his ally in the face of external threat. What the search party discovered at the ferry crossing filled them with a horror that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The warehouse showed obvious signs of torture and violence, bloodstains on the walls, rope burns on wooden posts, and implements of brutality scattered across the floor. But more disturbing than evidence of what had happened was evidence of what was missing. 31 men had simply vanished without a trace. Zimmermann, whose experience as a farmer had taught him to read signs that others might miss, discovered several crucial pieces of evidence that Thorne's men had overlooked in their haste to depart. Footprints in the muddy ground showed the movement of large groups from the warehouse to the wharf. Rope fragments indicated that prisoners had been bound and weighted. Most damning of all, several items of personal property, a broken spectacle lens, a distinctive bone button, a torn piece of fabric, provided proof that specific individuals had been present at the ferry crossing. The search party also found Dr. Fairchild's message wedged between stones where he had hidden it during his final moments of life. The physician's careful handwriting documented names, dates, and details of the conspiracy that had destroyed their community. His medical training had compelled him to record information with the precision that would be needed for legal prosecution, if legal prosecution ever became possible. Armed with this evidence, the survivors faced a terrible dilemma. They could report the massacre to county authorities and demand investigation, but Captain Thorne's claims about widespread corruption made them fear that such reports would only result in additional disappearances. They could attempt to confront Thorne's men directly, but the vigilantes had departed immediately after completing their grisly work, vanishing as efficiently as they had appeared. Most troubling of all, they realized that their community had been infiltrated by informants who had provided Thorne with detailed intelligence about residents' political opinions and personal associations. Someone they trusted, possibly someone they considered a friend, had compiled the lists that condemned 31 men to death. The investigation that followed, conducted in secret by the surviving residents of Millfield Township, revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives. Through careful examination of financial records, travel documents and correspondence, they discovered that Captain Thorne represented a network of political extremists operating throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The organization, which called itself the American Patriots Alliance, claimed to defend constitutional government against foreign corruption and domestic treason. In reality, it served as a vigilante force targeting immigrant communities, political opponents, and anyone whose loyalty to their twisted version of American values seemed questionable. Samuel Hartwell, the store owner whose neutrality had saved his life, used his commercial connections to trace some of the organization's activities. What he discovered was a pattern of disappearances, unexplained accidents, and mysterious deaths in communities throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. The Millfield massacre was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a systematic campaign of political terrorism. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it to authorities required finding officials who were not themselves compromised by the conspiracy Thorne had described. This task proved more difficult than expected, as several attempts to contact county and state officials resulted in intimidating visits from men who claimed to be investigating election fraud, but asked questions that suggested surveillance rather than legitimate law enforcement. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Judge Ezra Hawthorne, the elderly election supervisor who had witnessed the initial confrontation at the courthouse, had contacts within Pennsylvania's legal community that extended back to his service in the War of 1812. These connections included several federal officials whose loyalty to constitutional government was beyond question. Working through intermediaries, Judge Hawthorne managed to convey information about the Millfield massacre to federal authorities in Philadelphia. The response was swift and decisive. A team of federal marshals arrived in the township within a week, armed with warrants for the arrest of Captain Thorne and his associates. But Thorne and his men had vanished as completely as their victims. The buildings they had occupied were empty, their equipment was gone, and even their local informants had disappeared. The only trace of their presence was the horror they had left behind and the families they had destroyed. The federal investigation that followed uncovered evidence of the American Patriots Alliance in multiple states, but the organization's cellular structure made it nearly impossible to trace its full extent or identify its leadership. Several lower-level members were arrested and prosecuted, but Captain Thorne and Pike were never found. More disturbing still, the investigation revealed that the alliance had sympathizers within legitimate government institutions, county sheriffs, state legislators, and even federal officials who shared the organization's views about foreign corruption and domestic treason. While these sympathizers had not directly participated in violence, their willingness to overlook or obstruct investigations had enabled the conspiracy to operate with relative impunity. The legal proceedings that followed the Millfield massacre established important precedents for federal authority over political violence, but they provided little comfort to the families who had lost 31 husbands, fathers, and sons. The perpetrators remained at large, the victims were never recovered, and the community itself never fully recovered from the trauma of November 6, 1844. In the immediate aftermath of the federal investigation, Millfield Township began a slow process of rebuilding that would take decades to complete. The Blackstone mine closed within 6 months, partly because of economic factors, but mainly because the Welsh and Scottish workers who had operated it were dead or had fled to other communities. The farming families who remained found themselves working larger plots of land, but the shortage of labor and the absence of the commercial network that had supported their operations made prosperity difficult to achieve. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond economic considerations. Survivors found themselves unable to trust neighbors whose political sympathies remained unknown. Social gatherings became strained affairs as conversations avoided topics that might reveal dangerous opinions. Children grew up hearing whispered stories about the night when 31 men disappeared, learning to fear political involvement and to suspect outsiders of harboring hostile intentions. Mrs. Catherine Parry, whose husband Gwilym had been among the victims, became the unofficial keeper of their memory. She maintained detailed records of each man who had died, including their families, their occupations, and their contributions to the community. Her meticulous documentation served both as a memorial to the dead and as evidence for future investigators who might someday bring their killers to justice. The broader impact of the Millfield massacre extended throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states as word of the atrocity spread through immigrant communities and political organizations. The revelation that American citizens could be murdered for their political opinions sent shockwaves through ethnic enclaves that had believed themselves protected by constitutional guarantees of due process and equal treatment. Political leaders who had previously dismissed concerns about vigilante violence were forced to acknowledge that extremist organizations posed a genuine threat to democratic institutions. New laws were passed strengthening federal authority over political crimes, and additional resources were allocated for investigating organizations that claimed to operate above existing legal authority. But these improvements came too late for the 31 men whose bodies were never recovered from the Susquehanna River. Their families lived with the constant hope that their loved ones might somehow have survived and would eventually return, while simultaneously grieving for losses that could never be definitively confirmed. The mystery of what had happened to Captain Thorne and his associates remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 1863, a dying Confederate soldier in a Virginia hospital confessed to a Union chaplain that he had participated in political murders in Pennsylvania before the war. The confession provided enough detail to confirm that the soldier was indeed one of Thorne's men. But he died before providing information that might have led to other conspirators. The soldier's confession revealed that the American Patriots Alliance had evolved into one of the networks that supported Southern secession, viewing the Civil War as an opportunity to eliminate foreign corruption and restore America to its original principles. Several of Thorne's associates had joined Confederate military units, where their experience with organized violence proved valuable in irregular warfare operations. This connection between the Millfield massacre and the broader political crisis that led to civil war illustrated how extremist violence could escalate from local terrorism to national catastrophe. The 31 men who died in the Susquehanna River became early casualties of ideological conflicts that would eventually claim hundreds of thousands of American lives. In 1867, as Reconstruction efforts attempted to rebuild American democracy on more inclusive foundations, Congress established a commission to investigate political violence during the pre-war period. The Millfield massacre was among the cases examined, and testimony from survivors was incorporated into official records that documented the systematic campaign of intimidation and murder that had targeted immigrant communities and political opponents throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The Commission's report concluded that organizations like the American Patriots Alliance had posed a greater threat to constitutional government than their foreign enemies they claimed to oppose. By attacking the democratic processes that allowed peaceful resolution of political differences, vigilante groups had undermined the very institutions they claimed to defend. But for the survivors of Millfield Township, these broader historical conclusions provided little solace. They had learned through bitter experience that constitutional protections meant nothing without the social consensus necessary to enforce them, and that democratic institutions could be destroyed by citizens who claimed to be saving them. The ferry crossing where 31 men had died was never rebuilt. The buildings gradually collapsed from neglect, and eventually the site was reclaimed by the forest that bordered the Susquehanna River. By the turn of the 20th century, only a few foundation stones remained to mark the location where American democracy had suffered one of its darkest defeats. Yet the memory of what had happened there continued to influence the community for generations. Families who had survived the massacre passed down stories that emphasized both the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of vigilance against those who would destroy them. Children learned that constitutional rights required constant defense, and that the price of political freedom was measured not only in battlefield casualties, but also in the courage to stand against extremism wherever it appeared. The 31 men who died in the Susquehanna River on November 6, 1844, had committed no crimes except exercising their constitutional rights as American citizens. Their deaths served as a brutal reminder that democracy's enemies could emerge from within as well as from without, and that the greatest threats to American freedom often came from those who claimed to be its most devoted defenders. This mystery shows us how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when citizens lose faith in legal processes and resort to violence to resolve political differences. The men who died at Millfield were victims not only of political extremism, but also of a broader failure of American society to protect the rights it claimed to guarantee. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.